You're listening to the podcast When Life Gives You Lemons, presented by me, Emma Levy. Having worked with elite athletes for most of my career, it's always intrigued me that a significant number of high-performing individuals have encountered some form of adversity earlier in their lifetime. My fascination into this grew when I had my own brush with adversity, when I was diagnosed with breast cancer in May 2020, in the midst of the global pandemic at the age of only 36. During this period, I questioned whether it was my positive mindset or maybe something deeper, which enabled me to bounce back and to train and compete for a triathlon just 1 month following completion of all active cancer treatment. The goal of this podcast is to explore this concept further by meeting a variety of high-performing individuals who have experienced adversity but who have come back stronger. Today, I'm welcoming Sir Trevor Phillips to the podcast. Trevor is currently the presenter of Sky News' flagship weekend programme Sunday Morning. He's a businessman and journalist winning multiple awards over the years, and previously was the twice-serving chair of the London Assembly and the founding chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. He was knighted in 2022 for services to equality and human rights. I've invited Trevor on the podcast today to talk about mental health, which is a subject he feels passionately about, following the tragic death of his daughter Sushila in 2021, following a long battle with anorexia. Firstly, do I call you Trevor or Sir Trevor?
The rule in our household is that titles are only used when accompanied by a horse and a damsel in distress. So Trevor's fine.
Thank you. So I went to school with your daughter Sushila, and it's funny when you see the parents of your old school friends, sometimes you want to revert to that childhood self, but I'm going to try my hardest to act like a grown-up for the duration of this conversation. I just wanted to start by saying how sorry I am for the loss of Sushi. Like I said, I went to school with her and I have such fond memories. We used to do sport together at lunchtimes until about year 9, I think, when we were 14 and suddenly she stopped coming to sport. And looking back on reflection, I wonder if that was when she started to become ill. But at the time, I didn't really realise that. But I do have really fond memories. I remember her beaming smile. I remember she used to give the best hugs, hello and goodbye. And we really used to laugh a lot. And I can't imagine what it must be like for you guys to have lost her. So I really am really very, very sorry about that.
Thank you for that. And I mean, I remember those days. And I think the way that we think about it now is that we were fortunate that she was with us for the length of time she was. Because you're right. It's hard to know with this particular illness when it starts, if there is such a thing as an actual start. But I think we know that she was troubled from around that period when she would have been 12, 13.
Yeah, it's very young. I'm going to come back to the article that you wrote in the Times about your need to speak out on mental health. But I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about you. Because I think you're very well known within the British public. Your voice is recognised, I think, in many households. However, I'm not sure how much you like to talk about yourself or how much you do talk about yourself. But when I was researching you, it seems like you had quite an interesting childhood. You're one of 10 siblings. Your parents moved over from what was then British Guyana. And I wanted to ask you, how was your childhood?
Well, I think like most children, I remember my childhood fondly. I suppose that you would now say that it was rather an odd childhood, but in fact, not that unusual for the children of immigrant parents. My family came here in 1950. The principal reason was that, well, the principal, if you like, proximate reason was that my oldest sister, who was 90 this week, actually, wanted to be a nurse. And she couldn't train at what we would call at home. Most Guyanese, most West Indians refer to the Caribbean still now as home. She couldn't train there, so she had to come here, and she went to Glasgow. She trained also in London hospitals, spent some time in Paris, actually. But I think the underlying reason that my parents moved was because my father, who was left school at 14, was quite an ambitious man, was disappointed because the routes to if you like, promotion. He'd worked in the docks and got himself promoted and so on. But the routes were blocked in those days, which would be the 1940s. And my mother actually wanted something better for her children. So they got on the boat and they came here. But, 10 children, poor prospects, because England didn't quite turn out to be the place that I think they hoped it would be for them. 10 children, 2 rooms, it doesn't quite compute. So like a lot of families, they sent some of us back home. So I grew up for most of my childhood with my aunt and my grandmother in Guyana. I spent 4 or 5 years here between about the ages of 7 and 12. But most of my childhood was in Guyana. But the important point, I suppose, is to say that for the most part, I never really lived with my parents, because my father then died when I was 18. And then at that time I was already at university, and I'd sort of taken a different path. But my childhood, I suppose, would be characterized by, funny enough, living in a small town with 2 elderly ladies, my sister and various cousins, because a lot of us got sent back there, including cousins from Trinidad as well. And that part of it, it's easy, one can cast a sort of golden light on it, but I think probably it was pretty lovely in many ways. And as a teenager, funnily enough, I went to a boys' school, and I became part of a gang of 8 or 9, most of whom subsequently have moved to North America. We are all still in touch. If I'm in North America, we kind of gather overnight, drink a few beers. And funny, you were saying that one reverts. It's very interesting. When we all get together, we all revert to the roles that we played as sixth formers back then.
How did that feel, being sent back to Guyana? Was there like a sense of abandonment at all when your parents are staying in the UK and you were being sent back?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the truth is, I didn't know any different. But I think that there are probably two. Yeah, there's probably 2 things. First of all, this was the case. I mean, when I first went back, I was 15 months, so obviously I wouldn't have known much. And in fact, when I met my parents, I guess at the age of 6 or 7, it wasn't so much they were strangers to me, because one of the things that I think our families, immigrant families, are very good at is keeping alive the sense of the clan. So I sort of knew them but didn't know them. And we were, we lived in North London at that time. Well, we lived in North London and still in a relatively small house with a lot of us. So we were pretty close. So I never really felt in some way outside of anything. I think that if you're asking, did I feel in the end I missed anything? I think that would come much later. And I think probably it's something I've only reflected on in middle age. Maybe I should put it like this. I guess I grew up rather not in some ways as a solitary child. My nearest sibling is 6 years older than I am. So, a lot of my life was, as I say, away from my parents in a little village on the coast in Guyana with these 2 elderly ladies and a sort of shifting cast of sisters, brothers, cousins. So I had to sort of make a lot of my own life in some way. And I think one of the things I learned much later, or I've come to think much later on, is that in most families, you get to learn about yourself because of what others in your family say about you. You're reflected by in your brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, and people will make jokes about what sort of person you are and so on. It's rather, I think, for me, not a tragedy, but just something I've come to learn is that I didn't have any of that. So in a way, I didn't really get to understand much about who I was really till quite late in life, probably into my 40s,
Wow.
well into my 40s, because I hadn't had that period of getting to have my character reflected in the eyes of those around me.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, where do you think you got your drive and your determination from to succeed in life?
Oh well, that's pretty straightforward, and it's a word that I think I've used already about 20 times in this conversation. I mean, we were immigrants, and the thing that people I think quite miss about most immigrants, because we've got a narrative that says immigrants are people, basically sad people who are fleeing war and famine and so on. That's sort of true, though it is truer of people who move, for example, to the next door country because there's a war or conflict. The people who get on boats and travel thousands of miles into the unknown, often into places where they're not very welcome, are a different breed. These are the people, these are usually the odd ones. They're the people who in the village who look around and say, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. I don't care what the risk is. I'm going to take it. And I think what I discovered, again, I didn't realize this until quite late in life. That's what my parents were. And incidentally, it is what my grandparents were as well. My grandfather, who I never knew, my maternal grandfather, I never knew, disappeared when my mother was a teenager. And the reason he disappeared was that, like a lot of West Indians at that time, they would go to America for work. And the conventional thing was a century ago, they'd go to work on the Panama Canal, or they would go and pick cotton in the South. But a smaller group, of whom some of my family were, got on boats, went to New York, and my great aunt got off the boat, and she then went to live in Harlem. My grandfather, we think, jumped off the boat and probably swam ashore, then disappeared. No one ever saw him again, except that in recent times, what we've discovered, and here's something I think we haven't. I've never really had the reason to talk about publicly. We've recently discovered him in the records of the American Army. He joined a regiment which became known as the Harlem Hellfighters in the not in this but in the aftermath of the First World War. So, funnily enough, this is somebody that we only know through history. Anyway, the point about all of this is that we're an immigrant family who basically are a bit restless, rather ambitious, and I think if you were to talk to virtually any member of my family, of my generation or the next generation, and I suspect of my grandchildren, they'll be the same kinds of people.
Yeah. So, you think being an immigrant in the UK that time gave you that drive to succeed?
It's part of drive to succeed, by the way, but it is also, if I may say so, something that you might be familiar with, Emma, which is the insecurity of being in a society that you're never sure really likes you.
Yeah. So, do you remember experiencing racism as a young boy when you were in the UK?
Yeah, but well, I'll just preface it by saying that the reality of racial prejudice is that you can make a tremendously spectacular thing of it, and it's unpleasant, and in some cases, as we know, it's murderous. By and large, though, what it is a sort of daily drip of exclusion, a lot of which you don't notice. So, for example, I had, when I was at school here in England for those few years, I had, boys are always in a gang. There were four of us, and there was one boy whose house I never went into. Actually, I was never conscious of it particularly, but I looked back and I realized that his mum would always call him in for tea. And unlike other boys, I would never get into that house. My sister, and I think this was much more hurtful, when she was 16, 17, a person she thought of as her best friend had a birthday party, didn't invite her. Now, why that was, no one can be sure, but I suspect that was really because her family didn't want my sister in the house. So, it's part of one's everyday experience, and sometimes it can be hurtful. Quite a lot of the time you don't notice it, actually. But I would also say, by the way, that one of the things about this country is that differences of ethnicity they're not always obvious, and they're not always a bad thing. And as a child growing up, I don't think we always would have noticed them. I mean, on the one hand, I suppose it's probably fair to say I would be in fights because of it, and I'd get called names and so on. It's a little bit of that, well, that's the way it works. That's what people do. In a way, that's their problem. It's the way we think about it. But there are other things that, in a way, I don't want to say I recall them with pleasure, but I recall them with a sort of a sense that there was a different way of thinking about racial difference, which isn't all negative. I remember my sister recently told me that she would go to piano lessons on Saturday morning. And quite regularly, not every week, but periodically, a lady whose house she would pass would be standing on the step and would ask her to come in and light the coal fire. Well, why would you do that? And honestly, what is the thing? And a child being invited in? Of course, we now know that these would be extremely Orthodox Jews who wouldn't do anything like that on a Sabbath. So they would look for the nearest person to, whatever it is, turn on the lights, light the fire, and so on. And it was okay for a child. And in a funny way, I think back on that and I think, that's a kind of good world of difference, isn't it? I know it's not an answer to your question about racism, but I think when people talk about the racism of those days, and I don't want to underplay it. My father would say to us that when he first came, he would walk the streets looking for somewhere to stay because, people wouldn't have black men in their boarding houses and so on. My sister, as a nurse, would tell you that there was no question that they were regarded as somehow skivvies, the black nurses. She then went on to become a very distinguished nurse and run a hospital and so on. So there's no doubt that those first days were very cold, but the reason I don't like to over stress it is that if you make that story purely one of what people did to us, what you forget is the resilience and the courage and just the sheer grit of our parents and our elders who faced all that down, got on with their lives, and made a success of it.
Yeah, so you've kind of taken that positive mindset towards it. But do you think any of those those potentially racist behaviors drove you towards your work in equality and human rights?
In my own particular case, I would say that the fact that I ended up where I ended up was uh, probably for a different reason. I mean, it's worth saying that I started life not in this sort of territory at all. I was a chemist and an engineer.
Totally different.
Well, it's a different sort of world. Though I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago, and it occurred to me that the point about being an engineer is that what you're constantly trying to do as an engineer is literally that: engineer the world so it works for you, works better for you. And there's a sort of temperament that says, and this is probably almost certainly my temperament: is there a problem? How do we solve it? Is there an equation that will help me find a solution to this? Is there a fix? Um, so I don't think that I'm not a kind of natural, if you like, race equality warrior. I think probably I came to it much more as, oh, there's a problem. Shouldn't we fix it? Um, that's one thing. But the other thing I guess I would probably say is that I came from growing up in a country which was historically impoverished for partly by colonialism, but actually much more by the fact that it is an ethnically divided society in which um, essentially a kind of tribalism has meant that we were never able to take advantage of our natural resources for the simple reason that people would rather see things go to waste than cooperate with people who are of a different background to them. And if you really want to see an object lesson of way a divided society can impoverish everybody, Guyana is a fantastic example. Until recently, they've now discovered oil, so now everybody's going to be it's going to be the richest small country in the world. But until 5 or 6 years ago, it was one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, and purely, entirely because of racial division. So probably is more driven by that experience than anything else.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I want to get on to talk about mental health. So you wrote an article in the Times in June of this year where you wrote that your daughter's death gave you a new mission to speak up on mental health. And you wrote that Sushi recorded a 1-hour testimony on her phone. And you believe that she was setting her family a mission and that you now have a job to do. And I'm just going to read what you wrote. You wrote, her preoccupation was what she called the fear that keeps the mental health system paralyzed. How do you expect the situation to get better if you don't do everything you can to make it better? So I wanted to ask you, how are you seeing through this mission?
Thus far, not as well as I would like to. It's a very difficult thing to get your arms around. First of all, I mean, you knew Sushila, and she was a rather charming. That charming is such a weak word. She had the quality of making people like her, want to be on her side. Actually, and I'm grateful to the way you described it at the beginning of this conversation. But I think she was probably also quite bossy, and that came through in later life, even in her last 24 hours. as I described in the article, she collapsed in a shop. Somebody administered CPR, as it were, basically, literally brought her back to life. And she looked around and said, "Who told you to do that?" So her video to me was pretty much by way of instruction. She'd spent a long time in the mental health system. And her feeling was that though there were wonderful people in it, the system itself was poor. It wasn't responsive. The people who were closest to patients were not as well trained as they might be, however well intentioned they were. And she also felt, as do I think a lot of people who are in the system, that patients were not listened to, and that quite a lot of the time, had they been listened to, their problems could have been resolved or at least ameliorated to an extent. It's probably worth saying that I came to the view that the parts of the system, or to put it in more brutally, the condition that she endured, was the seventh circle of hell. I mean, if anybody who has been in some of the acute eating disorders units will know, the minute you walk through the door, you can smell despair, and you know that you are in the presence of death. And I think what she wanted to say, if I were going to summarize it, is that most of us, most of the time, want to avert our eyes. And why wouldn't we? Because it's awful. You know, and I'm walking down the street with her. She looks like a skeleton. She frightens children. And that's objectively truth. It's not that they're bad people or their parents should teach them to be better. Frankly, we got used to it, but she was a walking skeleton. And I think what she wanted to say is, for some people at the extreme end of mental illness, life is hell. And the rest of us should acknowledge that. And that would be the start to at least starting to find ways out of that hell for some people. The particular condition that she has, whatever people say, the truth is nobody really understands it. There isn't enough science. I think there's an awful lot of nonsense talked about it. Families get blamed and so on and so forth. The truth is we just don't know. We really don't know. And I think her view was that the first two things we can do is have compassion and understanding for those who are suffering it. And secondly, be honest with ourselves about how little we know, and be ready to speak honestly about both of those things. So my job, I guess, is to basically to go around saying what I've just said. I'm not an expert. I'm not a medic. I'm no longer the parent of a child with this illness. But all I can do is talk about our experience and perhaps make it more acceptable for everybody to talk. One of the things I've been really struck by is that since I wrote that piece, the number of people of, for whom I had, who I know, who I had no idea had a similar experience, who spoke to me about it. And that, I think, in itself is telling. The fact that people I know well, who knew that I had a daughter who was suffering from anorexia, never spoke to me about their own child's suffering. And maybe that's a place to start. And I think that's probably what she was trying to tell me to get on with.
So basically opening it up for conversation, more people acknowledging it. But also, like you said, we don't understand enough and we don't have enough science. And do you think that's a funding issue?
Oh, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it's partly, scientists, there's something scientists won't do these days because they're thought to be stigmatizing and so on and so forth. But actually, I suspect that if there were more money available for study of the condition, and God knows there's no shortage of cases to study now, as far as we can understand it.
I read 1.25 million people in the UK have anorexia, which is quite staggering, really.
And of course, the thing is, for many people, it's a transient condition. But there are things we don't understand. For example, what makes it not a transient condition? You know, you will know this. There would have been girls at school with Sushila who went through their phase of eating disorders, but for whom, in a way, it went away. And we don't understand what make the difference between that and what happened to Sush. That would be a start, understanding that. We don't know whether this is biological and physiological or whether it is a psychological and emotional state. And if you don't know that, how can you actually begin to think about what the remedies are? So part of it is money. I think part of it is also, though, purely will. There is no... I mean, there are some people for whom... I'm going to try and put this as straightforwardly as I can. There are some people who will claim mental health problems because there's a kind of veneer of, I won't say glamour, but something specialness for some people, particularly some people in the public eye, to be able to say, I have to look after my mental health issues. Well, to be honest, quite a lot of the time when I hear that, it does make me furious because nobody who is really in the grip of a serious mental illness ever says that.
Yeah.
Certainly not in that way.
It's separating, isn't it?
It is, in some way. If you've actually met somebody, and I don't mean somebody who is at Sushila's extremes, but even some people who are seriously ill, who are helpless and despairing, do not know what to do, don't even really know what's wrong with them. That is a whole different kettle of fish from somebody who faces a low mood, difficulty in their lives, to which I'm sympathetic, but I think that should not be mixed up with the situation of people who are truly in the grip of demons.
Yeah.
Again, it would be a good start if we could at least have that conversation. Because what then happens is you get into this, I think, rather unpleasant thing in which somebody says, I went through this and I recovered. And nobody will ever say this out loud. But what they mean is, I was strong enough or smart enough or clever enough to recover. I feel so sorry for somebody who didn't have my strength of will, or the friends or the family who would support me. And of course, that's not the difference at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. It's something bigger than
You're
that,
tempting
isn't
me
it?
to go to places where I don't necessarily want to go to, but it is an aspect of this which does make me
Yeah.
cross.
And with these soaring rates of eating disorders and things like self harm as well recently, especially since the pandemic, what damage do you think that social media and things like TikTok are having on that?
Oh well, I think there's no question that these are. I'm never going to blame social media. I think these technology is always a tool, and we can use it, not use it. We can constrain it, not restrain it. But what is absolutely clear is that it's amplification, and it has amplified some unhealthy trends. I think I've come around to the point of view. I didn't start here, but I've come around to the point of view that when people say they're influencers, they genuinely are influencers, and sometimes their influence is baleful.
Mm.
It's one thing selling a cardigan. It's another thing making cutting your arms feel like it's the answer to something. So I think social media, that has provided an accelerator for something which has always been malign. I mean, it's worth saying from my point of view, my daughter suffered before social media
Yeah.
turned up. She was copying other people's illnesses in various ways long before she had a mobile phone. So I'm not going to blame social media, but what I will say is that it's put something that we experienced on steroids.
Yeah. And I just want to read something else you said in the article that I found really interesting when you said, it's hardly surprising that young people are anxious and depressed with the worsening economy, the environmental activists warning of climate catastrophe, et cetera, et cetera. But, what can we do about this? How can we give young people the resilience to deal with life? Because we talk a lot about resilience on this podcast, but how are we giving the young people the resilience to deal with all these difficulties that are arising?
Well, I think we've got to do two things. One is we have to be transparent. We've got to be open, and that means coming back to something that I said a moment ago, not being simplistic about travails. I mean, sometimes we just have to be honest with people and say, I hear how you feel, but you will get through it because actually that's what human beings do. And I think what is happening now, particularly in the public sphere, and I'd say this to many public figures, don't polish the problem. There's nothing heroic about being a casualty of mental health. It doesn't make you attractive. It doesn't make you glamorous. It makes you a victim of mental illness. So I think the first thing I would say is with young people, let's help people get things in perspective. Let's remind people that most of us, most of the time, do get through these difficulties. All of us are low, all of us have difficulties, but there is strength in every one of us. And if we can't find those strengths, there are often people around us who will help us find them. That's what families do. That's what friends do. So I think talking, but talking in a positive way that is not just about how bad I feel, but how can I get out of this, is important. And I think the second thing is that, I guess in a way, where we began, because you asked me about whether I'd experienced racism. And I guess in a long and rather rambling way, I said, yes, I had, but I'd also experienced kindness out of difference. And I think that there's a responsibility on public figures, not just to describe the world as a dark and dystopian and depressing place, but also to talk about the things that make us better people, and also to remind people that actually we can make things different. You know, if I come back to that point, one of the things that really angers me is when people say, during the Black Lives Matter year, when people were saying it's never been as bad as this, it's worse. This is a terrible racist country. It's never been as awful as this. And I want to shout, talk to your grandparents. You know, talk to the grandfathers who, like my father, had to said, I could not find anywhere to lay my head at night. Talk to my sister who said, I was the best in my class, but I wasn't going to get promoted. Talk to people who were beaten in the streets. And then ask yourself whether, though we know some of those kind of things happen, in those days, that was natural. That was the order of things. That's what people thought was okay. Today, nobody thinks that's okay. And think to yourself, is it really worse than it used to be? Of course it isn't. So maybe one of the things we just need to say to people, and that this is incumbent on people like me, we have to have the courage to say, stop feeling sorry for yourself. And by the way, don't do down all those people who struggled against that racism. Don't do down all of those people who, you know, I think about my friend Marjorie Wallace at Same, who 30 years ago wrote for the Sunday Times and started to bring the issues of mental health out. And people would say, this is a bit embarrassing. Why do you want to talk about, you know, this person? Why would you get somebody to talk about their nervous breakdown because nobody will invite them to dinner parties anymore? I think people just need to grasp that we do make progress as a species, and we make progress through people struggling, talking openly, throwing the light on things that have gone wrong. And every time we say it's all so terrible and it's worse than ever, what we're doing is disrespecting those people who have made the world better. I mean, I feel very strongly about this. I think that particularly, I think there's a baby boomer thing that we failed in a way to tell our children, now our grandchildren actually, that it is worth fighting to make things better, because actually our experience in our lifetime is that is how things change. That is why we live in a richer, healthier, better world than we did 2 generations ago. Sorry, I'm going on, but you know what I mean?
That's really good. It's a really refreshing outlook to hear, and actually really aligns with my values. And it's what I try and tell my kids all the time. And I also really believe, really strongly believe, that we do all have strength within, and we just sometimes need to try and find that strength. Thank you, Trevor. I know you need to rush on, but thank you for talking to us today. I really do appreciate you taking the time. And I can imagine it's probably not easy to talk about Sushila, but I do imagine that she's looking down from somewhere and she's probably laughing, and she finds it hilarious that I have her dad on my podcast. So thank you.
Oh yeah, she would be. Well, you know, she had that sort of slightly mordant wit. She'd be. I'm trying to imagine. she'd be looking down and she'd be saying, "Well, you never said all that while I was alive. Why didn't you?
Exactly.
Why did? How come you're saying it to Emma?
Exactly.
Why don't you say it to me?" She'd be going, "No, thank you, Emma. It's been a real pleasure."
Thanks very much. Really nice to see you as well after all these years. Thank you.
Cheers.